Thank you so much, Amanda. And before I start, I want to thank also the California Museum for doing this, for inviting me. And I want to thank Jessica Cushenberry for everything she's done to make this thing so well organized and well put together. And also Sean Manwaring, who helped us organize the day. At least I was working with Sean as well. So I want to thank everybody who's been so gracious and, once again, put so much passion and effort into putting this day together. And I do want to encourage you, if you haven't gone to see the California Constitution, you really should do that. It's the first California Constitution. It's only on display every 5 years or so. So this is a good chance to see it. And you'll notice that on one side you have the version in English. Now on the other side you have the version in Spanish. And you see the signatories of the Constitution. Many of those, if you're familiar with California's early history, especially its Spanish-Mexican past, you will see names that maybe you'll recognize. Or you might recognize them because you recognize them from place names in California. And also, before I get any further, I want to thank Amanda for talking about the native peoples of California. I'm going to focus in this talk on the presence of people of Spanish-Mexican descent here in California that have been here for over 200 years. But this against the backdrop of the fact of the native peoples who have been here for thousands and thousands of years. And in fact, as every year it seems there are archaeological studies and discoveries that put the timeline of human presence in North America and in California further and further back. So anyway, we'll mention the native peoples, but really I want to be aware that they were the first people here. So let's talk a little bit about this. You probably are familiar with a lot of the place names in California. In fact, this is a great book, California Spanish Place Names, and you can go through and learn about so many of these places. And right, of course, we hear names like San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and so on. But you could see there places like Fresno, Contraloma, Corte Madera, all these places, all these Spanish place names, right? Why are they here? Well, they refer back to missions, pueblos, and families, right? Who gave their names or their lore, their tradition to these places, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about how that presence started here in California because, as you know, California is a state that has always had a presence of people of Spanish-Mexican backgrounds, and many backgrounds, in fact. So let's talk a little bit about how did that all start. Okay, so this here is a little bit. This is a reenactment that was done a few years ago of the Spanish arrival in Alta California. And the people in this picture are actually descendants both of the native peoples and of the Spanish people who arrived at that time, 1769. And of course, many of these people in the photo who are doing this reenactment have ancestry of both sides, both native people from California and Spanish-Mexican ancestry. So just to give a little bit of an idea of how this happened, of course you know that Spanish and Europeans had been exploring up and down the coast of the Pacific for centuries, since the 1530s, right? And they knew about this place that we call California, but they didn't really put a lot of focus on it because the Spanish and the Europeans in general were really interested in trade in the Far East, right? With India, China, etc. That was the main reason they were interested in the place we are now. So they really saw it as a place to sort of stop their ships, refuel, resupply, and head all the way to Manila, to the Philippines, right? But something happened in the 1760s, and that was that the British and the Russians began to also be interested in the coast of what we call today California. So at that point, the Spanish crown began in earnest to start thinking, okay, we need a plan. We need to keep those English and the Russians from setting up shop in California because we've been going up and down the coast for a lot longer. So what was their plan? The plan was the same plan that they used all over in the places in Latin America where they had settled and colonized, which was to establish towns, cities, right, and military bases. So it was sort of a two-pronged approach. What they really wanted to do was to keep the Russians and the English from settling in California, so they needed a military presence, right? But the Spanish didn't have that many soldiers, believe it or not. They didn't have enough soldiers to really put them all up and down the coast of California, right? So what their plan had always been was to incorporate the native peoples into the empire, right? The first step to that was trying to attract them to Christianity, right? To persuade them to become Catholics, Christians. And hopefully in doing so, they would also join the militia, become soldiers. So they established missions that you've probably heard about. I'm not going to go deep into the history of the missions, but they established missions with Franciscan padres, missionaries, to try and incorporate the Indians, the native people, into Christianity. And they also established forts called presidios, right? And in fact, there are 4 presidios on the coast of California today, in San Diego, Santa Barbara, San Francisco, Sonoma. So that's what their plan was. So 1769, the Spanish established, their first presence. So the king's plan, the king of Spain, and let's give you a picture of Charles, the king of Spain, Carlos III at the time. He knew that this process was going to take a long time, right? To imagine that native villages would become towns on a Latin American style took a long time. It had happened all over South America, but the Russians and the English were in a hurry to set up their own presence along the coast, and so he was in a hurry as well. So the first thing that they decided was, well, okay, this idea of developing towns is going to take a long time. They were hoping maybe it would take 10 years, but even that was very optimistic. So the next thing they thought to do was, well, we should bring people. We should bring colonists from places where we're already present, where the Spanish Empire was already present, and we'll bring them and then we'll settle them in these areas, and they will establish towns, and hopefully they'll also sort of, by their presence, attract the native peoples as well to live their kind of lifestyle, okay? So now, when I say Spanish people, we're talking people from what is today Mexico, right? So people from especially the areas of northern Mexico, the state of Sonora, Sinaloa, right? And places that are now also part of southern Arizona. So the Spanish had a presence along the coast. They had been traveling up and down the coast from ports along the coast of Mexico. But that's a very difficult trip, believe it or not. Just to go north from Tepic, along the Pacific coast of Mexico, and then up to Baja, and all the way up here, the winds are horrible, right? It's very difficult. And not only that, but the English, for example, had ships going up and down, pirate ships as well. So it was a very dangerous thing to try and go up the coast from Mexico to what is today California. So the idea was to try and find a way of going by land, right? If the king thought, well, if we can, and his governor, Felipe de Neve, who was the governor of the Californias at the time, thought, well, what if we could bring people overland from the east? That way we wouldn't have to worry about the winds, the seas, pirates, all those difficulties. If we could find a way to come overland from where we're already established, then that will make things perhaps a lot easier. We would have this corridor of migration that people could use, right? Well, of course, the native peoples had been migrating north and south for millennia along these routes, both from Baja California and from Sonora and Sinaloa. And so they decided to try and see if they could make the same journey. And so they asked a man named Juan Bautista de Anza. Maybe you've heard of him. The name Anza is all over the place in California. If you've been in the Bay Area, there's De Anza College, right? There's the Juan Bautista de Anza Trail, which goes all along Highway 101. So they asked a man named Juan Bautista de Anza, who was the commander of the Presidio, the fort in Tubac, in Sonora. And he managed, with his team, to get from Sonora all the way up to San Gabriel in what is today Southern California by land, right? On foot, on horseback, with the help of the native peoples along the way, especially a native chief, Quechan chief named Salvador Palma, and a young man named Sebastian Tarabal, right? And in fact, if you go to San Francisco, there's Tarabal Street, named after Sebastian Tarabal. So he made a trip in 1774-75, and it was successful. Went all the way up to Mission San Gabriel. So if you could see my pointer down here, Tubac Presidio there. He made the trip all the way up across the desert, right? Across the Colorado River up to Mission San Gabriel and came back and then recruited a bunch of families. And that's the amazing thing. So he recruited 40 families, 40 some odd families to make the trek from Tubac, Sonora. These families who lived all over here at Sinaloa, all the way up here into Sonora. He recruited 240 people, 40 families to walk, mind you, with their livestock, horses, mules, cows, from Tubac Presidio all the way to Mission San Gabriel, and eventually the goal was to arrive at the San Francisco Bay, right? And they came with him. And so in 1776, right, March 28, 1776, 240 people, and in fact, I think when they arrived, it was more like 242 or 3, because can you imagine, these people left a bunch of, so you had 40 families and a number of soldiers who were going along as the escort, and some of the families were soldiers, retired soldiers, and their children. They walked 1,000 miles, over 1,000 miles from Sonora, right? Stopped at Mission, across the desert, right? Across the desert, and where the Colorado River is, where San Diego is, across that desert, and from there they stopped at Mission San Gabriel, and then made their way all the way up north to the Presidio, what is today the Presidio of San Francisco. So, and along the way, only one person died, if you can imagine, and I think they had 2 or 3 babies along the way. So they actually, it was a net gain, the number of people who came across. And it's amazing because we hear about the Donner Party, right? And the tragedy that was going over the Sierra. This party was multiple times bigger than the Donner Party, and 1,000 miles, and they reached California. They reached Northern California. Okay, so these people came and settled, and this is another thing. when you think of the Spanish settlers that came from Sonora and Sinaloa, these were people who weren't born in Madrid, right, or in Seville. Most of the people who came were of mixed ethnicity, Spanish and the local indigenous people. Some of them, like Manuel Gonzalez, who was the second alcalde of the city of San Jose, the pueblo of San Jose, which I'm going to talk about, he was full-blooded Apache. He and his wife and 5 children were native Apache people from Sonora, and they came, and he was made the second alcalde of the city of San Jose. Many of the people that came also had African ancestry as well, and so this was a mix of people of different ethnicities who all came under the rubric of Spanish, okay? So they came, and these families settled in all along that route there. So Mission, what is today Los Angeles, all the way up to San Francisco, okay? And in fact, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but every year, their descendants, a number of their descendants, do a commemoration at the Presidio of San Francisco in June, and they commemorate the arrival of the Anza expedition and the founding of the Presidio of San Francisco in 1776. So when on the East Coast, the 13 colonies were fighting the Revolutionary War against the British, or they hadn't even started, they hadn't even declared independence yet, the Presidio of San Francisco was founded. So the people you see in this photo, this is from 2016 or 17. So a number of them are descendants of the original pobladores, the settlers. And some of them are reenactors that came out from Tubac in Arizona at the Presidio there. And then they have a horse team that comes from Central California. And you see the three flags of United States, Mexico, and California. And there's probably a Spanish flag over there out of the picture as well. But this was sort of the foundational event for the real Spanish-Mexican presence in California. So let's talk a little bit more here. All right. So why did the king want these people to come here other than to sort of defend the coast? Well, the idea was to create towns and have agriculture, have civic life. And so a number of the families settled near the fortress, the Presidio at San Francisco, and also down in Monterey. That's what I forgot. Monterey is the other location of the other Presidio. You had families that settled there, and so what they needed actually were to establish towns. And so in 1777, a man named José Joaquín Moraga, who was the deputy commander of the Presidio of San Francisco, he was asked to take a group of settlers, group of families, and go found a town, a pueblo, okay? And so they traveled about 50 miles south of San Francisco to a place where the river in the valley of what they called the Valley of Santa Clara, where the Guadalupe River runs through. And he named it the Guadalupe River after the Virgin of Guadalupe, who was so important in Mexico. And he founded, along with those families, a town, a pueblo. And they named it San Jose del Guadalupe. So the town of San Jose on the Guadalupe River, because his patron saint was St. Joseph. So he named it San Jose. And you can see here, this is a map of the town, the pueblo of San Jose, in 1781, I guess it says. And this map it's actually very small. It's like this. And it's at the San Jose History Museum, History San Jose. And you could see the way the town was set up. You had a bunch of houses, small houses, adobe houses with small yards, gardens, and each family had one, right? And then there's the river, right? And then outside of town were fields to cultivate, so to grow crops, and also to raise livestock, horses, cattle, etc. So they founded this town on the Guadalupe River. And in fact, it's so funny. I teach at San José State University, and right near us is a big building, a big company called Adobe, right? And now you know, it's called Adobe because right in the middle of downtown San Jose is the last Adobe that's standing that used to belong to the alcalde, the leader, the mayor of the town. So it's right there at the tiny little building at the bottom of this huge skyscraper. So that's why it's called Adobe, folks. And then a few years later, this one town, wasn't exactly flourishing. So the king and the governor, Neve, got the idea, well, we should found another town. And we should found another town on the river, the Porciúncula River, which is in Southern California, runs right through what is today Los Angeles. So in 1781, once again, they sent a military commander, a man named Rivera y Moncada, and he brought a number of families across the same route to settle near Mission San Gabriel. And they founded a town, a pueblo, right, called the Pueblo de Nuestra Señora Reina de los Ángeles. So the town of Our Lady, Queen of the Angels, on the Porciúncula River, the river that ran through that area. And so it eventually got shortened to Los Angeles or just Los Angeles, right? Or Bugs Bunny used to say Los Angeles, right? So in 1781, the second town, pueblo of California, was founded. And to this day, if you go to Los Angeles, you go to Old Vera Street, right downtown there, they still have that old pueblo there. And you can visit some of the old adobes, and it's a very cool place to go, right? And so these two little cities, these two little pueblos, became cities of, well, San Jose has about 1 million inhabitants, and I guess the general LA metropolitan area has, I think, 7, 8 million. So from these little nuclei, these little towns, right, eventually these became massive cities. So let's talk a little bit about then what did these families do? What was their sort of day-to-day life like? Well, it was an agricultural life, right? It was an agricultural life. They spent the day, most mornings, people would get up early, they'd have breakfast, and then they would go out to the fields. They'd go out and work the fields, right? Men, women, children. Men especially did the work with the horses and cows. They branding, riding, roping, all those things that we associate with cowboys, with vaqueros. And the children had their own chores. The women oftentimes also worked in the fields as well, but they spent most of the time taking care of the household or doing things like weaving, sewing, all those different things, all the kind of crafts that were important. And of course, you have to remember, up until the time the California gold was discovered in California, right? These people, these settlers, they were the minority. They were the small group of people. Probably, by the time California became a state, there was probably only 20,000 or so Spanish-Mexican population. The vast majority were still native people, right? So children, for example, would grow up speaking Spanish, obviously, but they also many times would learn the local native languages, depending on who they were living near or among, right? But it was also a very dangerous time, as you can imagine. There were no vaccines, there was no penicillin. Infectious diseases were always a problem. Not to mention the fact that California was filled with grizzly bears, the California grizzly roamed freely all over the place. Lots of other wild animals, and then the things that we always have to deal with: rattlesnakes, earthquakes, fires, drought. So life on the frontier was difficult, right? And of course, it wasn't just towns. With time, you began to see the growth of ranchos, right? The big ranchos that we associate with the rancho era in California. And in fact, a lot of the names of places in California come not only from missions or pueblos, but from ranchos. So, for example, right here, well, let's talk a little bit about what a rancho was, right? So oftentimes what would happen was, and this is true somewhat before Mexico became independent, but in a lot of ways, in a greater number after Mexico became independent from Spain, oftentimes the government would find a soldier, a retired soldier, for example, who had served the nation, and grant him and his family a big plot of land to raise livestock on, right? And they would call it a rancho, right, which is an enclosure of livestock. And especially when Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, this whole process accelerated of granting of ranchos to people. Why? Well, once Mexico became independent, they saw no need to carry on the process of creating missions, right, to incorporate the native peoples into the Spanish Empire. Instead, they decided that the missions had sort of worn out their welcome, that they had, in some ways had caused a lot of injustice. And so they decided, okay, we're going to close the missions, and which the missions were huge ranchos themselves, which were on the lands of the native peoples in which they were established. They said, okay, we'll give some of those lands back to the native peoples there, give a small portion, and then what's left over, we will allot them to settlers who have done something, important, like they walked from Sonora or Sinaloa, etc. So in the 1830s, the Mexican government in particular began granting a lot of ranchos to families all over the coast of California, okay? And so, and it wasn't just to men, it could also be to women. There were a number of women who received ranchos, but in order to receive a rancho, you had to demonstrate that you could cultivate the land and that you could turn it into something viable, right? And so soon, by the late 1830s, you have several hundred ranchos in California. And in fact, if you just think about where we are today, there are several ranchos in this area. So one of the main ones, Rancho Rio de los Americanos, right? Rancho of the River of the Americas. That was granted to William Leidesdorff, right? Who was an immigrant from the West Indies, right? Or Rancho del Paso. Also, ever heard of Del Paso Heights? Right? Because Rancho del Paso. Rancho San Juan. That was the rancho that was the area of Citrus Heights, Fair Oaks, Orangevale. In fact, you have San Juan Boulevard that goes all along there. So, and then, you could do this all over California. But the point was that this defined sort of the way the Spanish-Mexican people of that time defined their lives, was this rancho lifestyle. In fact, they began to develop sort of a very unique culture in Alta California, right? And it was a horse culture. It was a rancho culture, right? This is a beautiful painting from probably the 1830s, 40s, right? And people would visit, especially American, British sailors, sea captains that would sail around the Horn and come up the coast, they would visit California. They would visit Mexican California. And the first thing that would strike them was how amazing horsemanship, the horsemanship of the Californios as they begin to call themselves. The people that lived here who grew up in this territory, which was called California, Alta California, Baja and Alta California, they began to call themselves Californios, right? Or Californianas, right? As the women. And so they developed sort of a distinct culture because they were very far from the center, from Mexico City, right? It could take weeks and weeks to travel to Mexico City, either by land, which is very difficult because a lot of times those routes had been closed, or by sea. And so the Californio culture was very distinctive and marked by a number of things people would mention. Hospitality, for example. It was a huge, if you showed up at the rancho of a Californio family, you were automatically taken in, fed, given a bed, even if the bed was full of straw in the barn, whatever it might be, and even given a horse to ride to the next place. So hospitality was a key component of California lifestyle. Hospitality, family, right? In fact, there was so much family connection between intermarriage, people becoming godparents to children, all of these different things, that everybody considered themselves cousins, even if they weren't necessarily directly related. Everybody called each other primo, right? Cousin. So it was a tight-knit culture. But it was a culture, though, that was also open to outsiders as well. Many people, it was well known that these sailors, sea captains who would come in to the coast and settle down, oftentimes would marry women of the California families, right? And they'd be incorporated into that family. And then you'd have these huge extended bicultural families. So it was a culture that was both very tight-knit, but also very open to newcomers, right? And there was this sense of kind of distance from the central government in Mexico that sometimes would boil over, but for the most part, they were still loyal to Mexico. So, here's a quote from a man named Edwin Bryant, What I Saw in California, 1848. The men are almost constantly on horseback, and as horsemen excel any I've seen in other parts of the world. From the nature of their pursuits and amusements, they have brought horsemanship to a perfection, challenging admiration and exciting astonishment. The California vaquero, or cowboy, became famous all over the West, right? And still is to this day. And in fact, little children would be put on goats and sheep, when they were very young to learn how to ride, to ride in the saddle. So this idea of living on horseback was something so key. And in fact, a lot of the amusements of the Californios are well known to this day, right? The rodeo, the branding, bullfights, all of these things, but especially the fandango, right? The fandango, the famous, the dances and music performances that we've been treated to today, right? That went on for days. If you were married, if you had a wedding in Alta California, first of all, you'd probably invite everybody within 30 or 40 miles, probably because you were related to them, first of all, and secondly, because they'd be insulted if you didn't come. But the wedding would go on for 2 or 3 days, the party would, right? And so this lifestyle was well known and was commented on all over to the East Coast of the United States, right? Well, yeah. And in fact, you can see this is the Lugo family. This is probably the 1850s, 60s, the Lugo family in LA, right? This is their house, their rancho house. This was a wealthy consolidated family, but this is the typical rancho house of the early period, right before and after statehood. So California and the California lifestyle started to get a good reputation. And this is a close-up of the Lugos, right? And so as a result, many people started to come not just from ships on the Pacific coast, but overland, right, across the Sierra. And this is before gold was discovered. But soon, by 1846, you had thousands of Anglo-Americans who had crossed the Sierra and come to settle along the coast of Alta California, right? And of course, as we know, soon, by the summer of 1846, California has actually been captured with the help of the U.S. Army and Navy as part of the effort of the Mexican-American War. And so the Californios now find themselves under a new government. Now, how did they feel about that? Well, it really depended on the family. As I mentioned, Californios were fairly isolated from Mexico City because it was so far away, but at the same time, they were generally loyal. So most, especially in Southern California, took up arms, fought against the U.S. invasion, but some were more ambivalent. Some were more thinking in terms of, well, maybe this could be a good thing. Let's see, as long as we're treated well, as long as our rights are maintained, well, then we can make a go of it. And in fact, once California was incorporated into the Union, for the most part, Californios were loyal to the U.S. Part of that reason is because, excuse me, the treaty that was signed at the end of the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, guaranteed a number of rights to Californios, to Spanish-Mexican Californians. The right to maintain their language, the right to maintain Mexican citizenship even, to have both Mexican and U.S. citizenship, the right to maintain property. So the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were very good for Spanish-Mexican Californians. And as you saw, the first Constitution in 1849 was written both in Spanish and English. That was changed in 1879 with the next Constitution, as you know. So, just to give you an idea of some of the famous Californios and Californianas after statehood, as you see here, General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, or Vallejo, right, as he's known. He was the military commander in what is Sonoma and that whole North Bay region, but he was very active in California statehood and especially trying to maintain rights for Californios and Californianas. This is Pio Pico, who was the last Mexican governor of California, and he and his family were also very active in California post-statehood. Pio Pico and his family were also African descendants, so that's also something to take into account as well in terms of the ethnic makeup of the Californios. And this is an interesting fella, Cayetano Juarez. Now, if you've ever been to Napa, there is a restaurant called the Old Adobe Restaurant on the main drag there in Napa. I'm from Napa, so I grew up seeing that all the time. Well, that was actually Cayetano Juarez's adobe. And it's one of the oldest buildings in Northern California. And Cayetano Juarez is interesting because he was a Californio, but his grandmother and grandfather, his grandmother, Viridiana, was a Rumson native person from Carmel, from near the mission in Carmel, and she married a Spanish-Mexican soldier, Marcos Villela. So he was descendant from both the native people and the Spanish-Mexican people that populated California. And then later, this is my friend Greg Bernal, who's an some of you know him, right? He's an 8th generation Californio, and he is very proud of his ancestry. He's pointing out his great-grandmother there. And so there are thousands of people in California to this day who are descendant, right, from the Californios. Not only from the Californios, but also from the native people as well. So the Californio descendants are still here and are still proud of their heritage. Here are some examples of famous Californians who also had Californio heritage. This is a woman named Juana Briones. Juana was one of the most, she was a very important woman in the city of Yerba Buena, which is now San Francisco. She was a healer, she was a businesswoman. There's a plaque to her in Portsmouth Square in San Francisco. Very important woman, Juana Briones. They should have a statue for her. I want them to get a statue for her. This is Romualdo Pacheco, the 12th governor of the state of California, also descendant of Californios, right? And the only Latino governor of California to date, right? This man, old blood and guts, General George S. Patton, right? Helped the U.S. win World War II. On his mother's side, a descendant of Californios. He was born and raised in the Pasadena area in Southern California. This man here, contemporary Sam Liccardo, state assemblyman and former mayor of San Jose, also a descendant of Californios. So people descended from the Californios are here to this day. And it's very funny, just on a side note, and I'll stop here shortly for questions. I once met a man who was from Mexico, who was a descendant of the Vallejo family, the Vallejo family, from Mexico. So oftentimes, these families have, both sides of the family on both sides of the border, and they'll meet together, get together. So, but they're still here. And finally, just a little example of California descendants and their impact on California's lifestyle. Cliff May. Cliff May was a descendant of Californios. He grew up in San Diego and grew up around the Estudillo house in old San Diego. He designed the California ranch home. A lot of us, yours truly included, we live in ranch homes, ranch-style houses in California. Well, the original design came from Cliff May in the 1930s. He thought that there should be a type of home for California that fits California and the California landscape. And so he based it off his experience growing up in San Diego around the old Estudillo home. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I think we have some time for questions. Is that right, Jessica? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to have somebody with a mic, I think. Oh, and while we're getting ready, you can visit so many of these adobes here in California. This is one of my favorites. The Castro Adobe State Park in Watsonville. They've restored it. It's amazing. You should get it. You should go there if you get a chance. But there are others throughout the state. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'm happy to entertain any questions you may have. I see someone back there.
I grew up in California. I was good at Arizona. I was wondering, I've heard many different stories of where the word California is. So I would like to hear your comment.
Okay, I'll tell you the best to the best of my ability. By the way, if you want to learn all about California history, you can go to my website, californiafrontier.net. So there's a couple of theories, but the main theory comes from the book, The Adventures of Esplandian, right? He was a novel. There was a novel written in the 1480s, 90s, right? About a knight. And in it, there was a kingdom led by a queen named Calafia. And she was the leader of the tribe of Amazons in California, which was and their armor was made of gold, and they were fearsome. And so in that novel, there's this place called California, right, led by Queen Calafia. So that's probably the most likely scenario. Why did they choose to take that name from that novel and apply it to this place? I'm not sure. Other people have put out, other suggestions. Well, cálida fornax from Latin, meaning hot furnace, or that it was an indigenous word, etc. I think that the most obvious is that it comes from that novel, The Exploits of Esplandian. Okay, there's 2 questions here.
I'd just like to note that the California State Park System, if you go on their website, you'll see a lot of the presidios, pueblos, and you can visit.
That's right.
So many.
Yes, the California State Park System, exactly. And just a little pitch, I worked for the California State Parks, and boy, I wish we would fund them better, because there's so many wonderful things, state historic parks, that deserve to be, visited, seen, rebuilt. But yeah, exactly. The state parks website has wonderful information all about the different historic sites in California, all the presidios, missions, pueblos. And I think you, sir, had your hand up?
Yes. I also wondered about the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War, and if there were illegal Mexicans in California now who are descended from those original Mexicans who were here, though there were few. I haven't studied the Supreme Court, but I'm curious how courts have taken up that issue.
Okay, so can you?
So let's say, for example, that there was someone who was a farm worker in California today,
Mm-hmm.
descended from a Mexican who was residing in California.
So they had gone back to Mexico, right? Yeah.
So I'm just curious about that.
I don't know. That's a very good question. That's a really good question. It is interesting. One thing I didn't touch on was the whole California Land Commission, or the U.S. Land Commission, right? So that was one of the things that happened, was that when you had so many immigrants come during the gold rush, so many of these guys came to go to the gold fields and get rich. Well, they didn't get rich, and so they had to come back, and they said, I don't want to go back to the Midwest or the East Coast. I'm going to stay here in California. Oh, look, there's a great big open field here. I will, build a cabin, and maybe I'll start cultivating this land. Well, basically that was called squatting. And so they, at a certain point, you had all of these squatters, settlers on the rancho lands. Did I do so? Thank you. They had all these settlers on the rancho lands saying, well, possession is 9/10 of the law. I own this. And so the Californios said, no, this is my land. Right now, we're leaving aside the whole issue of the native peoples, all right? But we're just saying, they were saying, this is my land. Well, what the U.S. government did was to set up a land commission in San Francisco. And so if you were a Californio or Californio family that had a rancho that was in dispute, you would have to go before the land commission and prove that it belonged to you. Well, oftentimes these grants were provided by the Mexican government. There wasn't a paper trail. There was maybe a map, a diseño, hand-drawn of the borders of the property. And so you would go in front of the land commission. And if the other parties who wanted your land had more resources, well, they could appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court. So what happened is a lot of these families, most of these families, they were land rich, so they had big plots of land, but they didn't have cash. And so what they did in order to fund their legal defense was they would sell off pieces of land, oftentimes to the very lawyers who were defending them in court. And so, to make a long story short, most of the families wound up, even if most of the family's ownership was affirmed by the land commission, they wound up losing almost all of their land because they had to sell it in order to pay their legal debts. So the end of the story is that most of these families lost their land in California. Yes?
That's exactly what happened to my ancestors. They had a Rana Gulch in Santa Cruz, and then I was told that there was, they kept moving the fences in, sort of claim jumpers or something, and it ended up around the turn of 1900 or so that the local sheriff got the land or something, and it now is owned by Santa Cruz County. So anyway, that was my ancestors' rancho.
Well, if you have a chance, now you can go to the Bancroft Library's website, and they have most of these land dispute cases on file, digitized, it's a treasure trove of information because you have people, depositions of people talking about not only what happened with the land, but just the day-to-day life at the time. So it's fascinating. If you ever want to go look it up, you can read through them. Somebody else? Yes, and then there's somebody there too.
Professor, this has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Very thorough. I majored in history, so I really admired the presentation. I was impressed. Simple question. Why did California end up settling with Sacramento as the capital? You know, California had Monterey, and then with San Jose, and then Moreno Vallejo granted that land in Benicia. It never got established. Why did we settle here in Sacramento?
Yeah, I think part of it was the proximity to commerce on the river. I think that was part of it. I know San Jose had a lot of problems just in terms of crime and instability. I don't know why, say, Benicia didn't last. I think it was probably a combination of population density and commerce, I would think. But that's not, I'd love to know more about that and understand that well, because yeah, the first idea was San Jose, right? And then of course Monterey, Colton Hall, all those places, but they wound up, it's true, here along the Sacramento River. Yes.
Question. Back to the first map that you showed about the trail from Sinaloa to San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if that kind of divergence and path along the coast was because of the Tulare Lake. And I just wanted to know how far up it went. I know there were like big bodies of water there, right?
Yeah, that's okay. So when she says the Tulare Lake, you mean the whole area of the Central Valley, of the San Joaquin Valley, which was the great central swamp, right? Yeah, right, exactly. Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, yes. So why they didn't go up through the middle of the Central Valley? I think that was, first of all, there was that. Second of all, it also had to do with the native peoples along the way, right? Because the only reason they were able to get that far was because they had the safe conduct of the native people, especially the Quechan people in eastern or western Arizona, eastern California. So the Yokuts people and a lot of them who lived in the Central Valley were not friendly to the Spanish. So that was, first of all, one thing. Probably the fact that, yes, until, the 1860s, that Central Valley was a big swamp, and that's why it's so fertile, right? So that really wasn't a good trail. And then secondly, yeah, or thirdly, they also wanted to reconnect with the ocean, right? One of the things that the Spanish and other people had always hoped was that there was a way to do a river connection with that area, Arizona, Sonora, which was also a silver mining region, okay, and the coast. So the whole idea of connecting to the coast where ships could come and resupply, I think, was very important. So native people giving them safe passage, the problem of a big swamp in the Central Valley, and then the water connection in terms of commerce. Yes?
Yeah. So I was told at a lecture years ago with Los Californianos that one of the reasons that the settlement, thank you so much, that one of the reasons that the settlement of the Spanish, the Mexican immigrants, was along the coast because the gold was up in the hills and protected somewhat by the native tribes that lived in the hills. Would you comment about that?
Well, first of all, Los Californianos, I'm a historian member of Los Californianos, which is a wonderful organization of descendants. And
My mother was one of the founders.
oh, fantastic. So we'll have to talk afterwards. So I'm not sure. Now, I know that some of the Spanish padres in the 1800s had been told about the gold present by the native people, and they didn't want to say anything because they knew what might happen. But my understanding, especially recently was that, and things that I'm learning recently and from some interesting scholars, especially a woman named Marie Duggan, that really silver was the big deal. The silver in Sonora, but that they were hoping that California also had silver deposits as well. In fact, Anza, Rivera, these two guys I mentioned, in fact, the soldiers in Sonora were part-time silver miners, as were the commanders. So I think more than anything, silver was on their minds, and how they could either mine silver or bring silver from the mines in Sonora to the coast. But that's speculation. I'm sure there's somebody who knows more about it than I do. Any other questions? Yes?
This is another question about the past. I know that there were a lot of trade routes for turquoise from Mexico City to, I guess, Arizona, New Mexico area. And I'm wondering if that's probably the same path that just diverged at Casa Grande to California. You know?
Well, okay, so there was the famous Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which went from Mexico City up to Santa Fe. And then from Santa Fe, in the 1820s, you got the old Spanish trail that came down over here as well, was a trade route. I'm gonna plead the fifth on this one. I think that definitely the silver route was very important, and that whole there were also people from Culiacan that came as well. So I think just finding a connection between that area of Sonora, New Vizcaya was called, right, and the silver mining, I think was super important. And of course, you got to remember as well that the Apache were a big problem at that time for the Spanish, and that was one of the things that Anza did was to kind of, first of all, he brought peace with the Comanche, and then with the Comanche to try and pacify the Apache. So that was always an issue, deciding where you were going to travel. So I'm not sure. That's my answer. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we can finish. Thank you so much.